Oh, yeah.
Yeah.
Good evening, everyone. Thank you for coming to tonight's special city council meeting, tonight, Tuesday, November 1st, 2022, with the subject of the supplemental appropriation for Deer Street Associates and Affiliates. Kelly, can you please call the roll?
Yes, Mayor. Mayor McEachern,
Here.
Assistant Mayor Kelly. Here. Councilor Tabor.
Here.
Councilor Denton. Councilor Moreau.
Here.
Councilor Bagley.
Here.
Councilor Lombardi.
Here.
Councilor Blaylock.
Here.
Councilor Cook.
Here.
And next up is the public hearing and adoption of resolution authorizing a supplement appropriation from the unassigned fund balance for the settlement agreement between the City of Portsmouth and Deer Street Associates and Affiliates in the amount of $500,000. We will start with a presentation, I believe, from Susan.
Yes.
Thank you, Attorney Moreau.
Yes. So by way of background, if people are not aware, in 2016, when the city purchased the lot to build the Foundry Place garage, it also entered into an agreement with the owners of that lot, Deer Street Associates, also known as Foundry Place. That contract provided that the city would provide DSA 68 parking spaces in that garage and execute a contract for those 68 spaces. The contract also provided that DSA would convey Lot 2 to the city to meet its community space requirements for their projects on the adjacent and lots 6 and Lot 3. So in addition to conveying Lot 2, DSA was required to provide the city with $145,000 in order for the city to make some improvements on Lot 2 once the construction easements had expired. In March of 2020, DSA had executed and delivered a parking agreement to the city. However, the city did not execute that parking agreement. The city refused to sign that agreement. In October of 2020, the council was informed that it was in breach of their agreement with DSA for failure to do so. Shortly after, DSA initiated a breach of contract lawsuit with the city, alleging that the city was in breach of this contractual relationship because it did not provide them with the 68 parking spaces. And in their demand in the lawsuit, they claim that their damages were in excess of $4.2 million. In August of 2022, there was an offer to settle the lawsuit from DSA in the amount of $1 million, but the city did not respond to that offer. Throughout September and early October of this year, the city staff worked with DSA on a number of matters related to the issuance of building permits for their Lot 6 and Lot 3. And during these discussions, the settlement of the lawsuit was also addressed. On Friday, October 14th, DSA conveyed the warranty deed to the city for Lot 2 as previously agreed. In addition, building permits for Lot 6 and Lot 3 were issued to DSA. And DSA also paid the city $145,000 for improvements to Lot 2. On that same day, the parties also arrived at an agreement to settle the parking agreement lawsuit. The terms of that settlement are detailed in the attached settlement agreement that was attached to the agenda. In short, the city agreed to pay DSA $500,000 in order to resolve that lawsuit, in addition to waiving fees, license fees payable to the city for their use of city property while they are constructing their projects on their lots 3 and 6. The agreement also includes a mutual release of liability for any claims arising that have accrued to date from the breach of that contract. So on October 17th, the City Council voted to authorize the city manager to execute the settlement agreement and the limited releases and to pay DSA $500,000. Tonight, the City Council must consider the appropriation of those funds. It is recommended that the City Council approve the proposed resolution authorizing the payment of $500,000 to DSA from unassigned fund balance. This requires a 2/3 majority vote.
Thank you. Are there any city council questions before we go to a public hearing?
You're on.
Councilor Tabor.
And it's my understanding, City Attorney, that as part of this agreement, DSA will pay the city $145,000 to improve Lot 2.
They already have. They have issued a check, paid the funds for the $145,000. That will be set aside waiting for the completion of their construction projects.
Okay. Yeah, thank you.
Just to follow up on that, was there any change in the term, previously the term of the $145,000 was agreed to when it was contemplated that the hotel would be completed before the garage?
Essentially, it was contemplated, since the project started in 2016, it was contemplated that their projects would have been completed by now, and that the city would have had the opportunity to improve Lot 2 by now. So the prior documents had a expiration date that was before October 14th of this year. And pursuant to the settlement agreement, we've now extended that term so that the $145,000 can be spent up to 3 years after certificates of occupancy are issued for both the projects on Lot 6 and Lot 3.
Thank you. Any other questions before we get to the public hearing? We'll welcome any speakers. We'll do 3 minutes, 5 minutes, unlimited for any speakers.
Just clerical, it's hard to hear some of you that are speaking. City Attorney, you did fine, and Mayor, you were a little soft-spoken, and so was Councilor Tabor. Just had a hard time in the back hearing. Rick Beckstead, 1395 Islington Street. I'd like to thank the City Attorney for going and giving that synopsis and background. It gives the public and it gives the council that wasn't there and didn't live it. I've lived this project itself. I'll try to be short with my first 3 minutes. There's some clerical errors that are actually in there, though. So in March of 2020, the previous council, we actually voted on the agreement. I was the only no vote. And we authorized the city manager to actually implement that. And something happened when the city manager went to DSA. DSA actually rejected the agreement. A new agreement came forward to the council, and then the previous council had rejected it. I'm not exactly sure what the terms and everything were, but that was part of it. And I know that for a fact because when we started negotiations after the lawsuit was actually implemented, DSA then came back to the city during offers while we were negotiating that said that they were willing to go back to the original agreement that was brought forward to them in March of 2020. And I'll stop there. Thank you.
Thank you, Rick. Any other first-time speakers?
Peter Huda, 280 South Street. Tonight, first I would like to thank the mayor. Mayor McGeckern, you're not going to play the blame game. Thank you very much. I'll address the false statements made by the city manager, Kennard, and Councilor Tabor in the press that apparently did not check for available factual data. First, The original parking agreement was initiated as an exhibit to POCA executed by the city and DSA on September 16th, 2016, and approved by the City Council in 2016, authorizing the city manager Bohenko to execute. This agreement was to be executed after completion of the Foundry Garage in 2018 by the City Council of 2016-2018 under Mayor Blaylock, City Councilors Denton, Dwyer, Roberts, Reynolds, Quokka, Pearson, Beckstead, and Lazenby. At the time the DSA parking agreement was executed and sent to the city, so technically, Councilor Tabor, the City Council of 2016-2018 was in breach, not the previous council, as you stated in the press. The next thing I'd like to address, and I'll come back if I don't get to this, when I read the agreement and looked up the part for performance, which is generally what you do when you look at a contract, what needed to happen to trigger the transfer of the parking spaces. The agreement stated, DSA or a lot owner must begin payment for those parking spaces assigned to a lot when the lot receives a certificate of occupancy from the city, which requires the use of parking spaces in the garage. Up to that point, and all the time that DSA was applying for different permits, did not even put a shovel in the ground. Till today, we have yet to build anything. So the certificate of occupancy has never been fulfilled. That is why I voted like I did, and I would like the public to know that. So the questions are in my mind here are, why did the city manager Bohenko not sign the contract negotiated in 2016? Why did Mr. Rogers wait 3 years before construction was complete to notify the new city councilor and a new city manager at that time? The next question I'd like to ask is in the wording of the supplemental appropriation. Why does it state the balance to defray expenditures for settlement agreement? Why doesn't it say in complete settlement of the agreement dated 2020? I will hold the rest of my stuff for my next meeting. Thank you.
Thank you, Petra. Any other first-time speakers? Moving on to second-time speakers.
5 minutes, Mayor.
5 minutes.
Evening again, Rick Beckstead, 1395 Islington Street. So I guess I'll continue. I've spoken to you before about this. Mayor McEachran and Councilor Tabor are well aware of a lot of things. One of the really big concerns that I had was from 2016 up till when the agreement was signed in 2020 of September, that was supposed to be the end of the original agreement, where we were supposed to actually get the Lot 2, part of the agreement. There were two scenarios. Either we'd get the deed to the property, or we would get $800,000. Now, what most people don't know, and I know, only because I asked, was simply the fact that the city was contacted in September of 2020 by DSA, and they declared a force majeure. I'm not an attorney. Some people will understand what that is, but basically it allows you to be able to create a pause for 2 years. Now, the city was served with this force majeure, and I've confirmed this with the previous city attorney. City did nothing. No response. No letter, no phone call, no showing up in court, nothing. Nor did that council ever be made aware of it until October of 2020. And by that time, the way it was told, when you don't respond to a force majeure, it'd be like not showing up in court. So they're in favor of the plaintiff. So somebody in the city took it upon themselves to allow this force majeure to take place. And this was a pause by DSA. So I'm still trying to figure out where the delay is that we are found in violation, where we held up DSA under the original agreements. And then in September of this year, 2 years later, was when they started talking with you again, and whether they were talking before or after. Here's the thing, DSA bought Lot 6, acquired it, had 2 duplexes that were on it. They were multifamily units. They were affordable. And DSA and the, I guess, whatever you want to call, I don't want to call by name, but people of DSA actually were part of, at least at that time, the New Hampshire Workforce Housing Coalition. They made a promise to the city and to the residents of Portsmouth, but by losing those 4 units, 5 would come in place of the new projects, and they were going to happen on Lot 5. DSA does no longer own Lot 5, nor do they own Lot 4. They still own Lot 3 and they own Lot 6. So we lost out on something, a promise that was made by somebody that you are about to award $500,000 for that they don't deserve. The force majeure, I mean, they held the project up for 2 years by going and doing that. Again, I'm still not really sure who made that decision within the city, but the council, who should have been made aware of it when the force majeure was declared, was never done. Ever. So here we are today, $500,000, and we're about to go and award somebody that does not belong. Now, during my term there with two people that are on the previous council themselves and are fully aware of most of the things I said, except maybe the force majeure, we're in full aware that we were in negotiations. DSA, now, this council had been asked to go and sign the agreement February or March of this year, and you did it. So those 68, 69 spaces can be used as collateral. They can actually borrow against it in a city. Now, I know we made an agreement with DSA, but they can actually use them as collateral, and both the mayor and Councilor Tabor are fully aware of that. And I never heard any objections to it at all. So they can do that now. And they have not, as Councilor Huda had gone and haven't put a shovel in the ground. They haven't done anything. There's no grounds, none whatsoever. They should not be rewarded by this. By rewarding this is basically going to let developers out there that if we don't get our way, we're going to sue, and you basically just bring it to the council, and you're going to get something out of it. It's wrong. You represent the residents and the taxpayers of Portsmouth. You need to say no to this one. You need to ask questions. Even if you're still willing to go and do it with some of the stuff that I brought up tonight in that force majeure, I've never gotten an answer out of it. Ask the question before you actually go and release $500,000 of taxpayer money, which is unassigned fund balance. And yep, it won't add to the tax base. I mean, $500,000 is 3 cents on the dollar per thousand for each one of the residents that are in Portsmouth. But you are now up to almost $3 million by paying off 2 lawsuits to people that didn't deserve it. Thank you.
Thank you, Rick. Any other second-time speakers? All right, we will make an exception for Paige. We'll ask you to
And this will be my second time. One time only.
Okay.
Paige Trace, 27 Hancock Street. A force majeure is, to my understanding, something beyond the control of any of us. You say, oh my God, the will of God, a force majeure, we can't do anything. That happened during the pandemic. The unfortunate part about it is that Mr. Rogers seemed to be the only person, the only developer who wasn't going gangbusters in this city. Building, Procon, Kane, McNabb, they were all building during the pandemic. There was no force majeure that they declared on their building. Yet Mr. Rogers decided to declare a force majeure. And it was very odd. It was like he was this little island in the middle of very busy Portsmouth. So I'm trying to figure out what made him capable of asking for that force majeure. The past attorney called it a bad agreement. Not a contract, an agreement. And then, as the mayor said, a force majeure for Mr. Rogers. It allowed him to take a breather, take a year off, and do whatever he wanted to do. In the meantime, you did assign him the 68, not specific spaces, but the ability to lease 68 spaces. And then, lo and behold, he was still suing you. He said, oh, I'm coming back to the well, kids. Here I come. And I realized that things happen. But I go back to the past attorney saying it was a bad agreement. Basically, you sort of have to hold your nose and sign your life away. My words. So I'm asking you to think long and hard about spending $500,000 on a man who hasn't particularly acted honorably in this situation. You gave him the spaces, you did what you needed to do, you all held your noses, that was your choice to act that way, the mayor also. And I respect you for that. You tried your hardest to make a good deal, drive a good bargain with a gentleman who just thumbed his nose at you. He thumbed his nose when he declared the force majeure. So I'm asking you all now, is this the honorable man? Do you hand him the check and he hands you the lawsuit back or the property? What about Lot 2? There's nothing honorable about this gentleman. And I go back to the fact that Mr. Kane built his building on Maplewood. Mr. McNabb built his very large building on Daniel Street. And where was Mr. Rogers? Thank you very much.
Thank you, Paige. Any other second-time speakers?
Peter Huda, 280 South Street. To continue, as a resident and taxpayer whose dollars are going to pay for this decision, the big question that remains in my mind is why the lawsuit wasn't dropped when you gave away the parking spaces. So there were 68 spaces involved. This was the origination of the lawsuit. And I would like to also point out that this question was logically asked of the city attorney by Mr. McMenemy in February. And the answer we got was the usual answer. Oh, why don't you talk to the other guy? So the big question in my mind is, why are we now paying $500,000 for something we should have traded for? Because that was the original cause of the lawsuit. Also keeping in mind, at the time the lawsuit had been filed, DSA was actively promoting for sale any of these lots that he could be transferring the dollars to associated with this parking for new owners. So in reality, DSA did not suffer any damages, which would have justified the court case. The other thing I'd like to address is transparency. And I'd like to just call to attention your transparency or lack thereof at the meeting that you had at 5:15 on this. Basically, the meeting was a non-public meeting. You came out of the meeting, didn't answer any questions, didn't say anything, didn't even address the public as to what the meeting was, not even to say it was DSA related and you couldn't talk about it. You look for somebody in the audience, nobody there, move right on. No transparency. Also, when you put out the agenda, there was nothing attached to the agenda, so anybody could figure out what you were talking about in the agreement. Today, the agreement is out there. What's going on here, people? Thank you.
Thank you, Petra. Peter, you trying to come up here and speak now after not talking
Well,
before?
it's been 40 years since I sat in your place.
Okay.
And I thought when it came to the third round,
All right.
you were unlimited.
Five, you
And
can
I'm going to
certainly-
try to condense it and get it in with your 3 minutes. I'm here tonight not to talk whether or not you should appropriate the money.
Peter, sorry, most people are going to know exactly who you are in your address, but do you mind just for the folks that
Peter
were here
Weeks,
40 years?
Congress Street,
All right.
Portsmouth.
Thank you.
Two things I'd like to talk about. Number one, and this is no disrespect to this council or any council, because the city was in need of parking. They spent $5 million to buy this property, and one of the mistakes that was made was the city entering into a post-closing agreement. This was a mistake, and I hope this council and no future councils get involved in anything like that again, because we had a promise that they were going to develop the property. They went and got approvals, of which, if you check the records, they've gotten extensions on all of them. They haven't performed what they were supposed to do, and now we're being asked to pay $500,000 because they say the city hasn't done what they're supposed to have done. I don't think that's fair, but I understand that you've been advised that if this goes to court, that would cost you more than $500,000 in which to try the case. If that's the case, and I assume you've had non-public meetings in regards to the lawsuit, I think you should make that public, that you had from an attorney recommending to settle the suit for $500,000. And I would hope, if that's the case, that it was done in writing and it's not just done at a non-public session, which the general public has no access to. My second request would be the $145,000, and thank you, Mayor, for taking my call the other day, and you relieved some of my concerns. We're not really paying $500,000. We're paying $355,000. But I want to make sure that this council, if they're going to appropriate this money, requests that the manager bring back a resolution or an appropriation, that you appropriate that money that came from Deer Street, so it can only be used for building of the park, which is what the money was intended for. Too often, excess money comes in and it kind of gets lost in the shuffle. But you have the right to appropriate that, to designate it for that purpose. I realize you're going to vote this evening to pay. I think it's wrong. I don't think we got a good bargain from the person we bought the land from, but apparently you've been convinced that there's no other choice, and I'll respect that.
Thank you, Peter. Any other speakers that would like to come up and speak now for an unlimited amount of time? Going once. Okay, I will close the public hearing on this. Are there any additional council questions and/or deliberations? Councilor Bagley.
Thank you, Your Honor. I've got a couple of questions for the city attorney and then a comment, if you would allow. The first one, my understanding is we've already signed a settlement agreement, so we can more or less talk freely tonight because there's not
We
a
have-
legal risk.
Correct. We've resolved the lawsuit.
Okay. And would it be appropriate to disclose how much the city anticipated pursuing a lawsuit would have cost the city?
So we had engaged outside counsel to represent the city in this matter. And in discussing it with outside counsel, it was clear that we were going to incur attorney's fees just to go to court and defend ourselves in about approximately $500,000.
Okay, thank you. And I think those are important aspects to know. And I'm going to make a few comments as some of you know, I just started on the council in January and have never previously run or been on the council before. So most of this history I'm giving as a resident and not as a councilor. Portsmouth, for well over a decade, has been trying to build a second parking garage. And my understanding is there was a public-private partnership where a garage might have gone up with, I think, Harbor Corp at the Sheraton Hotel lot. That was quite some time ago. They might not have the details 100% correct, but that was kind of our first bite at the apple. And then our second bite at the apple on city-owned land would be to build the parking garage behind where it's now Jimmy's, but used to be the health food store. But that was not really agreeable to the public, so we didn't build there. And then I think there was a proposal to add a deck to the Parrott Street lot. That was also not agreeable to the public, so we didn't build there. And what that is the first place we were going to do a public-private partnership, so it didn't matter that it wasn't city-owned land. And then the next two places, we were going to do it on city-owned land. And then we kind of ran out of options that were close enough to downtown that were feasible places to build a garage. So we were in a situation, and once again, this is me looking from the outside in, where we had to buy a parcel of property where we could build a garage that was reasonably close to downtown. I know some people think where it currently is situated is too far away. I actually think it's the perfect place because as the city continues to grow, when these lots get developed, it'll be a continuous pedestrian corridor to the downtown. And when traffic comes off of exit 7, it doesn't have to drive through the downtown to get to the garage, which I think is very important. But then what you have happen is you have a property that's worth, say, $2 million or $2.5 million to pretty much everybody with one exception. And that exception is the city of Portsmouth, because the city of Portsmouth wants to do a very specific thing. It wants to build a garage that requires a certain amount of land in the right location. And through the process of elimination, we've gotten rid of most of those locations. So whomever owns that parcel of land now, to use a phrase, sort of has the city over a barrel. So we have two options. They're going to ask for more money than the land is worth to anybody else because they know to us as a city, for our specific purpose, it's worth more. Then we're in a conundrum. So we have two options. They won't sell it to us for what we think is a fair price, so we can do one of three things. One, we could just not purchase the property. Two, we could bring them to court through the eminent domain process, which is just an unpleasant process in general, tends to be very expensive, ultimately would probably cost at least as much as buying the property outright at the inflated price, if you will. So the city decided to buy the property at a price that is substantially above what it appraises for because it didn't really have a choice. And it's a complex real estate transaction, but that's how, as I understand it as a citizen, what happened. So this happens roughly 2016 timeframe. We build a garage. The garage is now built. There are some contractual obligations. Now, I would agree with the last speaker. I think that setting up the contract that way, where you have outstanding obligations like that, is a particularly poor way to set up a contract, especially when you have a city council that is continuous, but the people on the city council rotate every 2 years. It's very difficult to predict what will happen in the future. However, that was what was decided by the council. That's the contractual responsibility. Now, some speakers today talked about force majeure. I'm not a lawyer, so I won't attest to whether or not their claim of force majeure would have held up. I am, however, skeptical that you could say that 2020 was not such an unusual year that you would not get force majeure to hold up in a court of law, because why it's true many builders continued to build. Builders that wanted to start builds were unable to do so in a lot of cases because there was no additional capacity. So if you had an ongoing project, you may not have stopped that project, but you really couldn't start new projects because there was no capacity in the pipeline to start new projects. And I think we've all seen that. I mean, that's why we're facing inflation today, because there was a bottleneck, everything paused for a while, and then everything exploded. So don't think the force majeure argument holds up to scrutiny. So I don't question the city accepting the force majeure argument at its face instead of going to court for it, because I don't think we would have had a good case. So then we get to the point where we are today. And what happened in, let me just check the date here. I believe it was October of 2020. I'm sorry, November 16th of 2020, there was a city council meeting. That was back when they were on Zooms, but they're on YouTube, so you can go rewatch it. And there was a pretty robust discussion with the city attorney. I believe Trevor was on the line, and then the attorney for DSA was also on the line. And it was a pretty good back and forth. There were lots of questions asked about the parking spaces. My understanding from watching that was we weren't giving them 63 parking spaces. We were leasing them 63 parking spaces. So for me, you've got guaranteed people parking in a parking space at a garage that in a city where people complain that the garage is not full. So you've got somebody guaranteeing you'd write a check every month for 63 parking spaces. So that on its face seems like a sound financial move. But I understand that maybe not everybody would see it that way. So during the discussion, I believe it was Councilor Kennedy made a motion to make a slight adjustment to the original motion, which was to grant the parking spaces. And during that discussion, DSA's lawyer said, because there was an ask, how much more time do we have to refine this? And they basically said, you are well past any reasonable schedule. Now, that was the middle of COVID, so any reasonable schedule kind of gets thrown out the door, so to speak. But when the vote was taken, and I believe it was a 6-3 vote, to not grant the parking spaces, we put ourselves in a pretty precarious legal position, which is where we've ended up today. And not having been on that council and not having been on previous councils and not being a lawyer by trade, I certainly would be interested to hear from legal experts why the city was in a good position to deny that parking leasing agreement. And I haven't heard that from any legal experts. So with that being said, I voted against this settlement agreement. I appreciate the work that the city legal team did in crafting the settlement agreement. I am not 100% against it. I think it could maybe be a little bit better, but I also understand that there's no way out of this where we don't have to write a big check. And if the vote had gone different on November 16th, we wouldn't be sitting here tonight, and we wouldn't be writing a check that's going to cost, by my calculations, every man, woman, and child in the city $16.13. And what I'd like to see going forward is that the councils, when they're making decisions, are very cognizant of the legal ramifications of the decisions they make. Because sitting here today on the council, I more or less inherited the decisions of councils before me, and councils that will sit after this council will inherit decisions that we make. And a lot of the times, because of the way politics works, we don't agree with the decisions that previous councils made for lots of reasons. But if we're going to do something where we want to undo the doings of a previous council, I would hope we would do it only with expert legal advice. And presumably that expert legal advice would come from the city. But if for some reason a councilor decided they didn't agree with the city's legal advice, I would hope they would reach out to attorneys on a personal level and get a good legal foundation on why what they're doing is not going to put the city at risk. And then they could let the community know what that legal foundation is. So when we make these very difficult decisions that cost a lot of money, everybody in the community knows why we're in the position that we're in. And I've gone on too long. Thank you for
Councilor
indulging me, Mayor.
Bagley. Any other questions or comments? Counselor Denton.
Thank you, Your Honor. My question is to what former Mayor Weeks had asked regarding can we appropriate the funds as he suggested?
If I can answer that question, Mayor. The language provided in the resolution was language we got from bond counsel, so I would not want to stray from the language that they recommended.
And as a follow-up, we could still do that at some other point to appropriate the funds as he had suggested.
The 145,000?
Correct.
It is my understanding, and Susan and I conferred about this briefly, that when that money was received, it was placed in a special account for that purpose, and it is held by finance, restricted for that purpose.
Thank you.
Any other comments, questions? Counselor Tabor?
Thank you, Your Honor. None of us like to have to spend this money. It's taxpayer money to settle a lawsuit, and that's always distasteful. And we had lengthy discussions about any other options. It was my hope when we voted in February as the new council to to approve the parking agreement, that would remedy any breach of the post-closing obligation agreement. And if there were still a lawsuit, that we would prevail. But it's just really expensive to do that. When you have to use outside counsel that specializes in this kind of litigation. And an important point is that if we had gone to trial, we would no doubt spend $500,000 in lawyers' fees, and we would have no guarantee of ever getting the $145,000. So I agree with Councilor Bagley. The mayor and I were part of the last council and the November 16th deliberations, and some of us urged our colleagues not to simply vote down the parking agreement, take some other path, some negotiated path, and because the fundamental problem you have is when you inherited an agreement that a previous council made that says what the city has to do, when it has to do it, under what conditions it has to do it. And you're a new council and you say, that was a bad deal. Well, it might have been. I'm not denying that the price that the city had to pay for that land for the foundry was a high price, but it was the only property that would work. But when the new council or the incoming council looks at that, you have to remember that in a contract, new council or old council, there's only one city through the whole process. And so we have a responsibility when we take our oath to look at those contracts, see if we can change them, but we also have a responsibility to protect the city from breaches of contract that go to court and could end up in front of a jury with even higher numbers. It's a distasteful choice, but it's the right choice. It's the least miserable option. And what do we gain? We gain the $145,000. We hopefully get these properties finally on the tax rolls, whether Mr. Rogers develops them or whether someone else develops them. But we remove this barrier. So I'm going to vote for it.
Hey, Counselor Tabor. Counselor Dunn.
Your Honor, I move to adopt the resolution as presented.
Is there a second?
Second.
Any further discussion? Counselor Boa.
Thank you, Your Honor. I'd just like to say that in the current state that we live in and the city lives in with this contract, this is the best choice for the city and the people of the city. This is the least expensive way to resolve this, and this is the best path moving forward.
Counselor Bullock. Counselor Denton.
Thank you, Your Honor. having proposed a location close to Gary's Beverage was back in 2013, and then being on the council in 2016, having pushed to have the land re-evaluated by an independent assessor before we purchased it, it's safe to say that I'm disappointed by where we are today. And I really struggled with the vote to enter into the settlement agreement at the last meeting. It doesn't seem fair to residents, especially after this council re-entered into the contract early on. And part of me really actually did want to let this go to trial. And I hate to say it, but let the former city councilors who voted on the November 16th meeting be deposed and roll the dice and see what would happen. But that would be incredibly reckless to do. And the safest thing to do, and was in the best interest of the residents, is to pass this resolution, no matter how unfair it might seem, simply because it's the most responsible path forward from where we are.
Councilor Dutton, any other comments? A quick legal question. City Attorney, does this end any legal hold on documents that covered us and the previous council with regard to this case?
Do you mean non-public minutes, or?
I mean, we were advised of when we're sued by the...
For discovery purposes?
For discovery purposes.
Yes, it should release those,
Okay.
yes.
There's been a lot said, and I just want to share a couple of thoughts. I think to a person up here thinks we overpaid for the Foundry Garage. Let it be listened. Let's not pick the property publicly before we buy the property. Like, that's a good lesson to be learned by this council, any council. And I think when a member of the public was representing this as a bad agreement, I think the former city attorney said as much. And I think he even used the term over a barrel. And that happens when you pick the property before you buy it. So we've come down from this original decision, and then there was talk about precedent. I don't worry about developers coming in here and speaking and suing us unless we have a contract with those developers that we are liable if we break. That's a big distinction. And the precedent that I'm going to want to set as a council is that we honor the contracts, and then if we don't agree with the contract, we use every legal avenue to figure out a way out of them. Use our legal team, inside, outside counsel, to figure out how do we get out of a contract in the best way possible that limits the exposure that we have. Force majeure was covered again. I don't have an answer for that, but the pandemic was the pandemic. I'm happy to say that we got Lot 2 before this agreement. That was, as the post-closing obligation pointed out, we were to deliver the parking spots, they were to deliver the Lot 2, we were then to deliver a building permit. All of that happened before we settled the agreement. And then, I wish Mr. Rogers well. History has not been favorable to his ability to deliver on the promise of this. So whether it's him or some other developer, I think that we need to do more than have a surface parking lot that's closed off to the public, that is filled with a dumpster, that has gas cans strewn about. We need to do more in that place, and I'm hoping that this agreement moves us into the direction of actually doing something with that and using that community space in a way that is going to be meaningful for the city of Portsmouth. So with that, if there's no other comments or deliberations, I'll ask Kelly to please take a roll call vote on the proposed motion.
Assistant Mayor Kelly?
Yes.
Counselor Tabor?
Yes.
Counselor Denton?
Yes.
Counselor Moreau?
Yes.
Counselor Bagley?
Yes.
Counselor Lombardi?
Yes.
Counselor Blaylock?
Yes.
Counselor Cook? Yes. Mayor McEachran?
Yes.
Unanimous?
All right. I now await a motion to adjourn.
So moved.
Second.
All in favor? Aye. Good night, Portsmouth.